There's a specific moment most people never talk about. Not the gradual unraveling, not the slow erosion of what used to work, but the moment the ground actually disappears. One morning you wake up and the life you built no longer makes sense. The relationship you poured yourself into feels like a costume you can't zip up anymore. The career that once defined you now suffocates you. The beliefs that held your world together crack open, and there's nothing underneath. Everything collapses. Not slowly, not gracefully, all at once. And the most terrifying part isn't the collapse itself. It's the silence that follows, when you're standing in the rubble and you realize you don't know who you are without the structure that just came down. Jung studied this moment obsessively, not as metaphor, not as poetic language for a rough week. He studied it as a specific psychological event that happens when a person reaches the final stage of genuine transformation. He found that this collapse wasn't a failure. It wasn't evidence that something had gone wrong. It was the last thing that had to happen before the real person underneath could finally emerge. And he discovered that the people who survived this moment, the ones who didn't run back to rebuild the old structure out of terror, became something entirely different on the other side. Something they couldn't have planned or predicted. Something that only becomes possible when everything false has been demolished. Today, I'm going to show you what Jung actually discovered about the moment of collapse, why it occurs at a very specific point in the transformation process, and not a moment earlier. What's really happening psychologically when your entire life seems to fall apart at once, and why the people who understand what this collapse actually is are the ones who emerge from it fundamentally changed, while the people who misunderstand it spend the rest of their lives rebuilding prisons they mistake for safety. Jung didn't stumble onto this pattern casually. He encountered it repeatedly in the people who came to him at their worst. Not the ones with manageable problems, not the ones looking for minor adjustments, the ones whose lives had genuinely imploded, marriages ended, careers destroyed, friendships dissolved, health deteriorating. Sometimes all at once, as though some invisible hand had pulled the single thread holding everything together and watched the whole fabric unravel. His colleagues saw these patients as people in crisis who needed stabilization. Get them back to functioning, rebuild the structures, restore normalcy. But Jung noticed something his colleagues missed entirely. These patients, the ones in total collapse, weren't breaking down. They were breaking open. And the difference between those two things is the difference between tragedy and transformation. Breaking down means the psyche is failing. It can't cope. It needs repair so it can return to its previous state. Breaking open means the psyche has outgrown its container. The old structures can no longer hold what the person is becoming. And the container doesn't crack gently, it shatters, because the thing growing inside it has been pressing against the walls for years, sometimes decades, and the walls finally gave way. Jung would have called this the final stage of individuation, the moment the false self can no longer sustain itself. Everything you built on top of who you actually are, every identity you constructed to survive childhood, to be accepted, to feel safe, to be loved, all of it reaches a point where it can't hold anymore. Not because you're weak, because you've grown too real for the fiction to contain you. And when the fiction collapses, it takes everything built on top of it down with it. This is why the collapse feels so total. It isn't just one thing falling apart, it's the foundation that was underneath everything falling apart. And when the foundation goes, nothing that was built on it can stand. The relationship that was built on your people-pleasing collapses when you can't people-please anymore. The career that was built on your need for external validation collapses when validation stops filling the void. The friendships that were built on you being the caretaker collapse when you stop caretaking. It all goes at once because it was all connected to the same false floor, and the false floor just gave way. Most people interpret this as their life falling apart. Jung interpreted it as their life finally telling the truth. Every structure that collapses during this phase was a structure built on something that wasn't real. A version of you that was manufactured, not authentic. And the collapse is the psyche's way of clearing the ground so something real can finally be built. But you can't see that when you're standing in the rubble. All you can see is destruction. All you can feel is terror, and the impulse to rebuild as fast as possible is almost overwhelming. This is the critical juncture Jung identified. The moment of collapse presents two paths. The first path is reconstruction, grabbing the pieces and trying to put the old life back together, finding another relationship that replicates the same dynamic, jumping into another career that serves the same ego need, replacing the lost friendships with new ones built on the same caretaking pattern. This path feels productive. It looks like recovery. But Jung saw it as the most tragic choice a person could make, because you're rebuilding the same prison with different materials. You're reassembling the false self instead of allowing the real one to emerge. The second path is staying in the rubble, not rebuilding, not fixing, not rushing to replace what was lost. Just standing in the open space where your old life used to be, and tolerating the absolute terror of not knowing what comes next. This path, the one that feels like dying, is the one that leads to genuine transformation. But almost no one chooses it voluntarily. The discomfort is too extreme. The uncertainty is too vast. The loss of identity is too disorienting. The alchemists, whose work Jung studied for decades, had a name for this phase. They called it the nigredo, the blackening, the stage where everything must be reduced to ash before new material can emerge. This wasn't mystical symbolism. It was a precise description of what happens in the psyche during the final stage of deep change. The old must be completely destroyed, not partially reformed, not gradually adjusted, completely destroyed. Because anything that survives from the old structure will contaminate the new one. This is what makes the collapse so thorough. Your psyche isn't being careless, it's being precise. It's dismantling exactly the structures that were built on falsehood, and it's leaving standing only what was built on truth. The problem is that for many people, very little was built on truth, especially people who experienced childhood environments where being authentic was dangerous, where survival meant becoming whatever the environment demanded. Those people built almost their entire lives on adaptation rather than authenticity. So when the collapse comes, it takes almost everything. And this is terrifying, because you're left with almost nothing to stand on. No identity, no clear direction, no understanding of who you are when you're not performing the role you've played for decades. Jung described patients in this state as being in a kind of psychological freefall. The ego, which organized their entire experience of reality, has lost its footing, and without the ego's familiar structures, consciousness itself feels unstable. People in this phase often describe feeling like they're going insane, like reality has become fluid and uncertain, like they don't recognize themselves in the mirror. Jung was careful to distinguish this from mental illness, though the symptoms can look similar from the outside. Depression, anxiety, dissociation, inability to function, loss of motivation, withdrawal from relationships. Someone in the collapse phase can look like someone having a breakdown, but the internal experience is different. In a breakdown, the psyche is overwhelmed and failing. In the collapse phase, the psyche is reorganizing. It's dismantling an outdated operating system, and the new one hasn't been installed yet. The gap between deletion and installation is where the suffering lives. What makes this phase so unbearable isn't the loss of external things, though that's painful enough. It's the loss of the internal story, the narrative you've been telling yourself about who you are, why your life looks the way it does, what matters, what you're building toward. That narrative dissolves during the collapse, and without a narrative, humans feel unmoored in a way that's almost primal. We are story-making creatures. Take away our story, and we feel like we're dissolving. People who navigated this phase successfully were the ones who could tolerate not having a story, who could sit in the blank page without immediately trying to write the next chapter, who could resist the frantic impulse to construct a new identity, a new narrative, a new direction, and instead let the emptiness teach them something they'd never been still enough to hear. This required something Jung considered one of the hardest psychological tasks a human being can face. He called it the sacrifice of the ego's certainty, the willingness to not know. Not temporarily while you figure out the answer, but genuinely, deeply not knowing, and being willing to stay in that state for as long as the psyche requires. Most people can tolerate uncertainty for days, maybe weeks. The collapse phase can last months, sometimes longer. And during that entire period, the temptation to grab at something, anything, that restores the feeling of solid ground is relentless. A new relationship, a new spiritual framework, a new belief system, a new identity. Anything to stop the freefall. Anything to feel like you know who you are again. Every time someone grabbed at premature certainty during this phase, they aborted the transformation. They got temporary relief from the discomfort, but at the cost of the deeper change that was trying to happen. They rebuilt a smaller version of the old life and called it growth. And the psyche, which had been trying to break them free, had to start the process all over again. Sometimes years later, sometimes with an even more devastating collapse the second time. If you're in this place right now, if the ground has given way and nothing feels solid and you don't know who you are anymore, then what comes next might be exactly what you need to hear. And if you're looking for something to hold on to while the old structures come down, our guide, True Self-Discovery, offers 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's own methods. Not answers, not a new identity to grab at, just a way to stay present with yourself while the transformation does what it needs to do. Click below to get True Self-Discovery. Here's what Jung found happens if you can stay in the rubble long enough. If you can resist the reconstruction impulse, if you can tolerate the free fall without grabbing at the nearest ledge, something begins to emerge that wasn't visible before. Not because it's new, because it was always there, buried underneath decades of constructed identity. He called it the self, the totality of who someone actually is, as opposed to the ego's partial and often fictional version. The self doesn't arrive like a revelation. It seeps in like dawn, gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. A quiet sense of what's true that doesn't need external validation. A grounding that doesn't depend on circumstances. A knowing that doesn't come from the mind, but from somewhere deeper. Jung described this emergence as the most significant psychological event in a person's life. More significant than any achievement, any relationship, any external milestone. Because everything that came before was built by the ego, the constructed self, the adapted self, the performing self. And everything that comes after this emergence is built by something fundamentally more real. But Jung was honest about what this emergence looks like. It doesn't look like what the self-help industry promises. You don't suddenly become confident, successful, radiant, magnetic. The person who emerges from the collapse is often quieter than the person who went in, less ambitious in conventional terms, less interested in performing, less willing to contort themselves for acceptance. They might look diminished to people who valued the old version, less impressive, less accommodating, less fun. What they've actually become is honest. And honesty, Jung found, doesn't always look the way we expect. It can look like saying no without explaining, like leaving situations that everyone else considers normal, like choosing solitude over companionship that requires performance, like doing less but meaning it more, like having fewer relationships but ones where actual seeing occurs. The ground that forms after the collapse isn't the same kind of ground that existed before. The old ground was built from other people's expectations, childhood survival strategies, cultural conditioning, inherited beliefs about who you should be. It felt solid, but it wasn't. It was a consensus reality, agreed upon but not true. The new ground is different. It's built from direct experience of who you actually are, not who you were told you should be, not who you learned to perform, who you are when every performance has been stripped away and you're standing in the open air with nothing between you and your own existence. That ground is thinner, there's less of it, but every inch of it is real. And standing on something real, even if it's small, creates a stability that standing on vast expanses of fiction never could. Jung noticed something fascinating about people who had passed through the collapse and emerged on the other side. They stopped being afraid of the same things that terrified them before, not through courage or willpower, but because the things they used to fear had already happened. The loss of identity, it happened. The dissolution of their life, it happened. The experience of not knowing who they were, it happened. And they survived it, not just survived, discovered that what remained after the worst had occurred was more substantial than everything they'd lost. This is the paradox at the heart of Jung's understanding of transformation. You have to lose the life you built to discover the life you were meant to live. You have to let the identity collapse to find out who exists underneath it. You have to endure the period of nothing, the blank space between the old story ending and the new one beginning, to access a way of being that the old story was blocking. And this can't be shortcut. Jung was insistent on this point. You can't think your way through the collapse. You can't meditate it away. You can't read enough books to skip the freefall. You can't hire a coach to rebuild you before the demolition is complete. The collapse has its own timeline. The psyche knows how long the negredo needs to last, and trying to accelerate it is just another form of the ego trying to maintain control over a process that requires the ego to surrender control entirely. This is perhaps the most difficult thing about the collapse phase. It demands passivity from people who have spent their lives being active. It demands surrender from people whose survival depended on control. It demands patience from people who have been running from their own emptiness for as long as they can remember. Everything the collapse asks of you is the opposite of what your conditioning has trained you to do, and the people around you won't understand. They'll see your collapse as a problem to solve. They'll offer advice, solutions, plans, rebuild, move on, get back out there, start fresh. Their discomfort with your dissolution will make them push you toward premature reconstruction. Not because they don't care about you, but because watching someone they love stand in rubble without rushing to rebuild activates their own terror of groundlessness. Your collapse threatens their faith in the stability of the ground they're standing on. If your life can fall apart this completely, maybe theirs can too. So they need you to fix it quickly, to prove that collapse is manageable, survivable, temporary. But you know something they don't. You know that what fell apart needed to fall apart. Maybe you can't articulate it yet. Maybe you can't explain why you're not rushing to rebuild. But somewhere underneath the terror and the grief and the disorientation, there's a quiet recognition that the structures that collapsed were never really yours. They were assigned to you, expected of you, demanded of you. And some part of you is relieved they're gone, even as another part is terrified of the empty space they left behind. Jung would tell you to trust that quiet recognition, even when it contradicts everything the louder voices are saying, even when it makes no logical sense, even when it means sitting in uncertainty that feels like it might kill you. That recognition, that whisper of "this needed to happen," is the self speaking, the real you, underneath all the construction, finally having space to be heard because the noise of the false life has gone silent. What does the other side of collapse actually look like in practice? Hef documented several consistent changes in people who allowed the full process to unfold without aborting it. The first change was a dramatic reduction in performance. People stopped managing how others perceived them, not as a spiritual practice or a deliberate choice, but as a natural consequence of having lost the identity that required management. When the persona has been demolished, there's nothing left to project, and what emerges in its absence is startlingly simple: direct communication, honest responses, the ability to say, "I don't know," without anxiety, the willingness to be seen as you are rather than as you've arranged yourself to appear. The second change was a reorganization of values. Things that mattered desperately before the collapse, status, achievement, approval, being needed, lose their charge. Not because the person has become spiritually superior to those concerns, but because the psychological needs that drove those values have been exposed and addressed. The desperate need for approval was driven by a childhood wound that convinced you your worth depended on others' opinions. When the collapse exposes that wound, and you finally face it directly, the compulsive pursuit of approval loses its fuel. You might still appreciate recognition, but you're no longer organized around obtaining it. The third change was the emergence of what Jung called authentic vocation. Not career, not job. Vocation, the thing you're actually called to do when you're no longer performing someone else's expectations. People who passed through the collapse often discovered purposes they couldn't have imagined before. Not grandiose purposes, often surprisingly humble ones, but purposes that emerged from who they actually were rather than who they'd been pretending to be. And these purposes carried a kind of energy that no amount of willpower could generate. because they weren't forced, they were natural. The fourth change, and this one caught Jung's attention more than the others, was a fundamental shift in how the person related to suffering. Before the collapse, suffering was the enemy, something to avoid, fix, medicate, transcend. After the collapse, suffering became information, something to listen to, something that pointed toward truth rather than away from it. People who emerged from the Negredo developed an unusual relationship with pain. They didn't seek it, they didn't romanticize it, but they no longer ran from it, because they'd learned, through the most direct experience possible, that running from pain was what built the false structures in the first place. Every wall they'd erected against suffering had also been a wall against truth, and when the walls came down, both the pain and the truth came flooding in together. This is what makes the collapse sacred in Jung's view. Not sacred in a religious sense, sacred in the sense of non-negotiable, inviolable, a process that demands respect because it serves something larger than comfort. The collapse serves wholeness. It serves the integration of everything you've rejected, denied, and hidden. It serves the emergence of the person you would have been if survival hadn't required you to become someone else. And that person, the one who emerges, doesn't look like the spiritual archetype. They're not floating above their life in serene detachment. They're standing in it, feet on real ground for the first time, feeling everything without the buffer of persona or performance, engaging with reality as it is rather than as they needed it to be. And this is both more ordinary and more powerful than any mystical state, because it's sustainable. It's not a peak experience that fades, it's a baseline that holds. If you're in the collapse right now, I want to tell you something that no one around you is probably saying. You're not failing, you're not broken, you're not losing your mind, even though it might feel exactly like that. What's happening is the most significant psychological event of your life. The false ground is giving way so that real ground can form. And real ground forms slowly. It can't be rushed. It can't be forced. It forms as you face what the collapse exposed, as you grieve what was never real, as you sit with the emptiness long enough to discover it isn't empty at all. Jung spent his career watching people reach this moment. Some ran back to the old structures. Some grabbed at new ones before the process was complete. But the ones who stayed, the ones who stood in the open space and let the freefall teach them what solid ground actually feels like, those people became something he could only describe as whole. Not perfect, not enlightened, not beyond suffering. Whole. All the pieces finally assembled into one coherent person, instead of scattered across performances designed for different audiences. That wholeness is what the collapse is making room for. That's what all the destruction is in service of. Not punishment, not randomness, not evidence that you did something wrong. The collapse is the final stage of a change that's been building inside you for longer than you know. And the fact that it's happening now means you've finally grown strong enough to survive it. The psyche doesn't trigger a collapse the person can't ultimately endure. It waits, sometimes for decades, until the internal resources are sufficient for the passage. So you're not falling apart because you're weak. You're falling apart because you're finally strong enough for the falling apart to happen. That might be the most important thing Jung ever taught about transformation. The collapse isn't the opposite of strength. It's the consequence of it. It's what happens when you've accumulated enough psychological mass to outgrow the container you were living in. The container breaks because you've become too real for it. And what's on the other side of the breaking isn't emptiness. It's you, the actual you. Standing on ground that doesn't need to be defended, explained, or propped up by anyone else's approval. Ground that holds because it's made of truth rather than performance. The rubble clears. Not all at once, gradually. And what you build on the cleared ground won't look like what was there before. It will be smaller in some ways, less impressive to outside observers, less carefully constructed, but it will be yours. Actually, genuinely, irrevocably yours. And standing on something real, even if it's just a few square feet of honest ground, that changes everything. That's what Jung discovered. That's what the collapse is for. And if you're in it right now, you're closer to solid ground than you've ever been, even though it feels like the opposite. especially because it feels like the opposite. If you haven't yet, and you're looking for a way to stay grounded while the old structures come down, our guide True Self-Discovery has 24 Jungian reflection exercises designed not to rebuild you, but to help you meet whoever's standing there once the dust settles. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.